Eleanor moved through the hushed opulence of the Pinnacle restaurant like a spirit, her movements precise and silent. The clinking of crystal and the low murmur of the city's elite were the soundtrack to her invisibility. Tonight, however, the air at the center table was thick with a dangerous stillness, emanating from the man who sat at its head, Angelo Rinaldi. His presence commanded the room without a single word. It was then that a brash young councilman, eager to perform for the Don, raised his voice, shattering the quiet. He held up his wine glass, his face a mask of theatrical disgust, and publicly berated Eleanor for a flaw that didn't exist. The accusation hung in the air, a deliberate, cruel strike designed to showcase his power over someone he deemed insignificant. Her manager was already moving toward her, his face pale with the intent to appease, to sacrifice her without a second thought. But what happened in that crushing silence would change the course of her life forever, and if you watch until the very end, you will understand why. Subscribe to our channel now and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Her name was Eleanor Vance, 28 years old, a woman whose dreams of designing buildings had been shelved to pay off the crushing weight of family debt. She existed in a state of quiet resilience, her life a carefully constructed routine of long shifts, bus rides back to a lonely Queens apartment, and the perpetual ache of solitude. Her uniform was her armor, a crisp white shield against a world that saw her not as a person, but as a function. She carried her dignity like a fragile heirloom, protecting it fiercely in the small, quiet moments away from the prying eyes of the powerful. Her strength was not in fighting back, but in enduring, in holding her spine straight when every instinct told her to crumble, a silent testament to an unbreakable moral core she refused to surrender. The oppression she faced was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of her days. It was in the condescending tone of her manager, Mr. Dubois, a man who wielded his minor authority like a weapon. It was in the entitled glances of the patrons, who dismissed her presence as they would a piece of furniture. It was in the cold, impersonal letters from debt collectors that awaited her at home. Her world was a cage of obligations and expectations, a stark contrast to the effortless luxury she served every night. She felt the injustice of it all, a quiet burn in her chest. But she had learned long ago that for people like her, righteousness was a luxury she simply could not afford. Her fight was not for grand justice, but for the simple, profound act of surviving another day with her soul intact. Despite the hardness of her life, Eleanor had never lost her capacity for empathy. She moved through her world with a keen, observant eye, noticing the hidden sorrows and small kindnesses that others missed. She saw the weariness in the busboy's posture, the forced smile of a fellow waitress, the flicker of fear in the eyes of a young couple dining beyond their means. She understood pain because it was a language she spoke fluently. This deep well of compassion was her secret, the part of her that remained untouched by the city's cynicism. It was this very quality, this quiet, unyielding light, that made her fundamentally different from the world she was forced to inhabit. A world built on power, ambition, and the casual disregard for the weak. Now frozen in the spotlight of the councilman's manufactured outrage, she felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks. The murmurs of the surrounding tables washed over her, a wave of judgment and morbid curiosity. Mr. Dubois was just a few feet away, his mouth already forming the words that would sever her from her precarious livelihood. She braced herself for the impact, her gaze dropping to the pristine white tablecloth. Yet, she did not flinch. She did not plead. She simply stood and absorbed the blow, her silence a more powerful defense than any word she could have spoken. It was an act of profound, solitary defiance, a refusal to grant her tormentor the satisfaction of her tears or her fear. From across the table, she felt a gaze that was different from the others. It was not pitying, nor was it contemptuous. It was the unwavering, analytical stare of Angelo Rinaldi. He had not moved, had not so much as blinked during the councilman's tirade. His stillness was a vortex, pulling all the energy in the room toward him. Eleanor could feel the weight of his attention, an intense, penetrating focus that seemed to strip away her uniform and her practiced composure, seeing straight into the core of her being. In his dark, unreadable eyes, she felt an unnerving sense of being truly seen for the first time, and it was more terrifying than any public humiliation. The manager cleared his throat, ready to deliver the final verdict. The councilman smirked, basking in his momentary victory. The entire room held its breath, a captive audience to her quiet demise. But in that stretched and silent moment before her world was meant to collapse, Eleanor dared to lift her head and meet Angelo Rinaldi's eyes one last time. It was not a plea or a challenge, but something else entirely. A fleeting, silent acknowledgement that passed between two solitary souls from opposite ends of the universe. An invisible line had been drawn, and in that instant she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. The journey home was a descent, a slow shedding of the gilded cage she inhabited for 10 hours a day. The packed crosstown bus was a world away from the hushed elegance of the Pinnacle, its air thick with the scent of damp wool and the collective exhaustion of the working class. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the neon-drenched luxury of Manhattan blur into a watercolor of indifferent lights. Each stop brought her closer to her own reality, a quiet, unassuming corner of Queens, where the buildings didn't scrape the sky but huddled together for warmth. The hiss of the brakes was a sigh of release, the final note in a symphony of servitude she endured daily, a transition from a world of champagne and whispers to one of silence and solitude. Her apartment was a sanctuary of meticulously ordered loneliness. A single armchair, a small table with one chair, and a narrow bed were the only witnesses to her life. There were no photographs on the walls, only the faint outlines where previous tenants had hung their memories. On a small, dusty bookshelf sat her only indulgence, a collection of heavy architecture textbooks, their spines uncreased, their pages filled with the blueprints of a life she had been forced to abandon. The silence in the small space was profound, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. It was here, in this quiet emptiness, that she allowed the mask of the deferential waitress to fall, revealing the weary woman beneath. The weight she carried was not entirely her own. It was the crushing burden of her father's medical bills, a debt that had metastasized after his passing, consuming her future. Her mother, a woman worn down by grief and worry, called every Sunday, her voice a fragile thread connecting Eleanor to a past filled with more warmth than her present. Each paycheck was a triage, a painful calculation of which creditor to appease, which utility to postpone, all while sending a portion home. This responsibility was her anchor and her chain, grounding her in a reality of endless work while simultaneously preventing her from ever truly moving forward. Her dreams were a currency she had spent long ago to buy a few more years for someone she loved. Her body kept a meticulous record of her labor. The constant ache in the arches of her feet, a dull fire that never fully extinguished. The small, silvery scars on her forearms from accidental brushes with hot plates. The muscles in her face, trained to hold a pleasant, unobtrusive smile for hours on end, felt stiff and foreign when she was alone. She was a master of self-effacement, of moving through crowded spaces without disturbing the air, of anticipating a need before it was spoken. This skill, born of necessity, had eroded her sense of self. She was a function, a pair of hands, a polite voice, an essential but ultimately invisible component of an elaborate machine designed for the comfort of others. The daily oppression was rarely overt. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. It was Mr. Dubois, her manager, inspecting her uniform with a sneer, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. It was the way he would publicly praise a male waiter for the same efficiency he ignored in her. It was the casual cruelty of a patron snapping their fingers to get her attention, reducing her to less than human. She absorbed these slights with a practiced calm, her face a serene mask that betrayed none of the quiet fury simmering beneath. To react was to risk everything. So she swallowed the bitterness, letting it settle in her stomach like stones, adding to the immense weight she already carried through her endless, grueling days. In the dead of night, when the city finally held its breath, Eleanor would pull one of the architecture books from the shelf. She would trace the clean, confident lines of a skyscraper, or the elegant curve of a bridge with a fingertip, her imagination taking flight. In these stolen moments, she was not a waitress. She was a creator, a builder of beautiful, enduring things. She envisioned spaces filled with light and air, structures that served not the whims of the wealthy but the needs of the community. This silent, secret life was her rebellion. It was the part of her they could not touch, the dream she nurtured in the dark, a flickering candle of hope against the encroaching shadows of her reality. From her small window, the distant skyline of Manhattan was a breathtaking, cruel jewel. It glittered with the promise of a world she could see but never touch. A universe of power and influence that operated on a set of rules she could not comprehend. The pinnacle was at the very top of one of those shining towers. A literal and figurative summit she could only access through the service entrance. She felt the chasm between their world and hers as a physical ache, a constant reminder of her station. The city was a monument to the very inequality that kept her trapped, its beauty a beautiful lie that masked the relentless grind required to keep its lights on. On that particular evening, the air in the restaurant felt different, charged with a low hum of anticipation. The usual murmur of conversation was more subdued, the clinking of silverware more deliberate. A new level of power had entered the room, and the entire staff moved with a heightened, nervous energy. Mr. Dubois scurried about, his face a mask of anxious obsequiousness. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck as she polished wine glasses behind the bar, watching as the center table was prepared with an almost reverential care. She knew, with a sinking feeling, that tonight would not be an ordinary night of quiet, invisible service. Her heart hammered against her ribs when Mr. Dubois assigned her to that very table. "Vance, table 12. Be perfect," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. She smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and approached the table where Don Angelo Rinaldi sat like a king holding court in absolute silence. His stillness was the center of a storm of nervous energy emanating from the men around him, including the brash young councilman who seemed desperate for his approval. She felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her as she moved, but she was acutely aware of only one, the dark, unblinking gaze of the man at the head of the table, a gaze that felt less like an observation and more like a verdict. She began the wine service with the practiced, steady hands that were her trademark. Her movements were fluid and economical, a silent ballet she had performed 1,000 times. It was then that the councilman, seeking to make an impression, chose his moment. He raised his glass to the light, a theatrical sneer twisting his lips. "Is this the best you can do?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "This wine is flawed." "Or perhaps," he added, his eyes raking over her with contempt, "it's the service." The accusation, baseless and cruel, hung in the air like a guillotine, poised to sever her from the only lifeline she had. Mr. Dubois' footsteps were a death knell on the polished marble floor, each click a countdown to her termination. The manager's face was a pallid mask of frantic apology, his eyes darting toward the head of the table, not at her. Eleanor stood frozen, a specimen under glass, the focus of every curious, pitying, and scornful gaze in the room. She felt the blood drain from her face, the air in her lungs turning to ice. This was it, the end of the line, the final humiliating collapse of her carefully balanced, precarious world. She braced herself not just for the loss of her job, but for the crushing weight of failure that would follow, a weight she was no longer sure she had the strength to bear alone in her silent, empty apartment. Then a hand was raised. It was not a gesture of violence or anger, but one of quiet, absolute authority. Angelo Rinaldi, who had remained as still as a statue throughout the councilman's performance, simply lifted his right hand from the table, palm down, a silent command that rippled through the room with the force of a shockwave. The manager stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape. The councilman's triumphant smirk faltered and died. The whispers at the surrounding tables ceased instantly. The entire, opulent space fell into a profound, heavy silence, a vacuum created and controlled by one man's effortless will. All motion, all sound, all intention was suspended, held captive by that single unadorned gesture. He was a man carved from shadow and discipline. His dark, impeccably tailored suit seemed to absorb the low light of the restaurant, making him a figure of pure silhouette and presence. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, a subtle hint of a life lived with immense pressure. His face was a study in controlled neutrality, a mask that betrayed nothing of the man behind it, save for the faint silvery scar that traced the line of his jaw, a whisper of a violent history he never spoke of. But his power resided in his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly unreadable, possessing a stillness that suggested he saw everything, processed every detail, and missed nothing. They were the eyes of a predator, patient and ancient. His gaze finally settled on her, and the world narrowed to the space between them. It was not a look of lust or pity. It was something far more unnerving. An assessment. He seemed to look past her uniform, past her fear, and straight into the defiant, unbroken core of her. Eleanor felt stripped bare, as if he could see every debt, every shelved dream, every lonely night she had ever endured. He saw the way she held her spine straight, the way her chin remained level, despite the tremor in her hands. He was not looking at a waitress. He was looking at a fighter, and in his cold, calculating eyes, she saw the faintest, almost imperceptible flicker of something that looked like recognition. The councilman, now sweating under the weight of the silence, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The moment of his performed dominance had evaporated, leaving him exposed and foolish. Mr. Bland. Dubois stood frozen, a man caught between two terrifying forces, his fear of his powerful guest, now eclipsed by his fear of displeasing him further. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict to be delivered not by the restaurant manager, but by the silent king at its center. The power dynamic had been completely rewritten in a matter of seconds, and Eleanor was no longer the one on trial. The room had become Angelo Rinaldi's court, and he was the sole judge. He slowly lowered his hand and picked up his linen napkin, dabbing his lips with a deliberate, unhurried motion. Then, his voice, when it came, was not a boom, but a low murmur, a gravelly sound that cut through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. It was directed not at the councilman, but at her. "Perfectly handled," he said, the words hanging in the air, each one laden with a meaning that went far beyond the wine service. He was validating her composure, her silent dignity. He was dismissing the councilman's entire pathetic display with two simple words, turning the man's weapon of humiliation back on himself. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, the unexpected defense leaving her more stunned than the initial attack. He paused, his eyes still locked on hers, holding her captive in their intense, unyielding grip. He folded the napkin and placed it beside his plate with meticulous care. Then, he delivered the final, chilling blow. "Now," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, a private contract spoken in a public space, "you owe me one evening." The statement was not a request. It was a declaration, a claim. It was an invisible chain forged in that moment, binding her to him in a debt she didn't understand. She had been saved from one predator, only to be claimed by another, far more powerful one. The fear that had begun to recede came rushing back, now mingled with a terrifying, bewildering sense of obligation. With a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head, he dismissed the entire affair. The spell was broken. The councilman deflated, his face a mottled red of shame and fear. Mr. Dubois scurried backward, bowing slightly before practically fleeing toward the safety of the kitchens. Angelo Rinaldi returned to his meal as if nothing had happened, the men at his table following his lead, the conversation resuming in hushed, nervous tones. The incident was over, erased from history by his will. He had demonstrated his power not with a threat or a shout, but with a whisper, proving that true authority requires no volume. He controlled the world around him with the quiet certainty of gravity itself. A few minutes later, he stood to leave. His men rose with him, a silent phalanx of dark suits. He moved with a contained, predatory grace, his presence commanding a wide berth as he walked toward the exit. He did not look at Eleanor again. He did not need to. His mark was already on her. She watched him go, feeling the pull of that invisible debt he had placed upon her. The air where he had been sitting still felt charged, heavy with the weight of his presence. She felt a profound and terrifying shift in the foundation of her life, as if she had been standing on solid ground and had just discovered it was thin ice over a deep, dark ocean. Long after he was gone, the echo of his presence remained. The low murmur of his voice, the chilling weight of his gaze, the quiet finality of his claim, it all replayed in her mind. Mr. Dubois avoided her for the rest of the night, his fear of her now greater than his contempt. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an object of interest to Angelo Rinaldi, a woman who owed him an evening. She was safe from the petty tyrants of her world, but she had been drawn into the orbit of a far more dangerous sun. As she cleared the last of the plates from his table, her hands steady but her heart a frantic drum, she knew her invisibility was gone forever. If this story has captured your heart, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with someone who appreciates deep stories, and letting us know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your engagement helps us create more content like this. The days that followed were a study in suspended reality. Eleanor went through the motions of her life. The long shifts, the bus rides, the silent apartment. But a new invisible current ran beneath it all. She felt watched. Not in a menacing way, but with a persistent, unnerving attentiveness. Sometimes, leaving the restaurant late at night, she would see a dark, idling sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted, a silent sentinel in the sleeping city. It was never there in the morning. She told herself it was a coincidence, a product of her frayed nerves, but a deeper instinct knew it was him. He was a shadow at the edge of her vision, a presence that made the air feel heavier, a constant low hum of danger and possibility. He never came to the restaurant again. Instead, his world began to bleed into hers through a series of carefully orchestrated accidents. One afternoon, seeking refuge in a small, forgotten art gallery during her break, she turned a corner and found him standing before a stark, melancholic painting of a lone ship on a stormy sea. He wasn't flanked by his usual entourage. He was completely alone, his powerful frame looking strangely vulnerable in the quiet, sunlit room. He simply nodded at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and then turned his attention back to the canvas. The silence between them was not awkward, but dense and communicative, a shared moment of contemplation that felt more intimate than any conversation. The debt, he claimed, was called in not with a threat, but with a summons delivered by a discreet courier. A single, heavy, cream-colored card with a time and an address. The private lounge of the St. Regis Hotel. She went, compelled by a mixture of fear and a desperate need for answers. He was waiting for her in a secluded corner, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the table before him. He did not rise, but his eyes tracked her every step as she approached. The air crackled with a tension that was purely his creation. He gestured to the chair opposite him, his movements economical and precise. "Sit, Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his low voice, both a courtesy and a claim of ownership. She expected questions about the councilman, or perhaps a demand for information, a test of her loyalty. Instead, he asked about her. He inquired about the architecture books she checked out from the public library, a detail so specific it sent a chill down her spine. He had been watching her far more closely than she ever imagined. He spoke of the structural integrity of bridges, the poetry of a well-designed facade, revealing a knowledge that was both surprising and disarming. He was peeling back her layers, not with force, but with an unnerving, intelligent precision. She found herself answering honestly, the long dormant passion for her abandoned dreams stirring within her, forgetting for a moment just who she was speaking to. With each of these strange, quiet encounters, her fear began to war with a dangerous fascination. She saw the man behind the myth, a figure of profound loneliness and rigid control. She noticed the way his hands, though impeccably manicured, were never truly at rest, constantly betraying a tightly coiled energy. She saw the weariness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a deep, ancient sorrow that his power and wealth could not erase. This glimpse of his hidden humanity was more terrifying than his reputation, because it made him real. It made the pull she felt toward him, this dark and magnetic force, something her moral compass could no longer easily dismiss as simple terror. She tried to maintain her distance, to retreat back into the safety of her invisibility. After one of their meetings in the hushed reading room of the city library, she left quickly, her heart pounding, and purposefully took a different route home. She walked for miles through the anonymous city streets, trying to reclaim the feeling of being just another face in the crowd. But as she finally approached her block, she saw the familiar dark sedan parked halfway down the street, its engine off, silent and waiting. It pulled away the moment she turned the corner, a clear and chilling message. There was no escaping his orbit. He was not pursuing her. He was simply there, a fixed point around which her world was now forced to turn. He, in turn, found himself caught in a conflict he hadn't anticipated. Angelo Rinaldi did not do sentiment. His life was a fortress, built of discipline, suspicion, and calculated violence. Yet this woman, with her quiet dignity and unbroken spirit, was a crack in that fortress wall. He was drawn to her light, to the fierce, untarnished morality she carried like a shield. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of the man he might have been in another life, before the blood and the guilt had irrevocably stained his soul. This reflection was a torment, a constant reminder of a purity he had long since sacrificed. Protecting her had started as an impulse, a whim, but it was rapidly becoming an obsession. He began to orchestrate more, quote, coincidences, needing to see her, to test the reality of her goodness against the cynicism of his world. He would appear at a coffee shop she frequented, or walk through the park where she sometimes ate her lunch. These were not romantic overtures. They were clinical observations that felt increasingly personal. He never crowded her, never demanded more than a few moments of stilted conversation. But in these brief interactions, he felt the rigid control he maintained over his own emotions begin to fray at the edges. Her presence was a quiet disruption, a gentle but persistent force that was slowly dismantling the armor around his heart. The tension between them became a physical presence, a charge in the air whenever they were near. One rainy evening, as she was leaving a bookstore, he stepped out of a recessed doorway, holding an umbrella. He didn't offer her a ride, but simply held it over her head as they walked the 2 blocks to the subway station in a shared, profound silence. The only sounds were their footsteps on the wet pavement, and the rhythmic patter of rain on the taut black fabric above them. His proximity was overwhelming. She was acutely aware of the scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from his body, the sheer physical power he held in effortless reserve just inches from her own. At the subway entrance, he handed her the umbrella. As she took it, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body, a shock of heat that left her breathless. She looked up and met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw the mask of cold control slip. In his dark eyes, she saw a flicker of raw, unguarded emotion, a potent mixture of longing and conflict that mirrored her own. The moment stretched, suspended in time, the noise of the city fading into a distant roar. It was a silent confession, a dangerous acknowledgement of the invisible thread that now bound them together, pulling them closer, despite every rational reason to stay apart. He began to assert his protection in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her abusive manager, Mr. Dubois, was suddenly transferred to an undesirable suburban location. The aggressive debt collection agency that had been harassing her for months sent a letter stating her account had been settled by an anonymous benefactor. She knew, with a certainty that both terrified and shamed her, that it was his doing. He was clearing the obstacles from her life, smoothing her path with his immense, unseen power. She was living under the shadow of his influence, a gilded cage she had never asked for, and the sense of obligation became a weight heavier than any debt she had ever known. The worlds truly collided on a crisp autumn evening. He had asked her to accompany him to a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an event filled with the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures. He did not explain why, and she did not feel she had the right to refuse. Dressed in a simple, elegant dark blue gown he had sent for her, she felt like an imposter, a ghost haunting a world she did not belong to. He guided her through the glittering crowds with a proprietary hand at the small of her back, a touch that was both a comfort and a brand. She saw the curious, speculative glances they received, and she understood that tonight she was not Eleanor Vance, waitress. She was Angelo Rinaldi's companion. The atmosphere was one of forced smiles and whispered power plays, a battlefield disguised as a party. Eleanor felt the oppressive weight of 100 calculating gazes, but Angelo's presence was an impenetrable shield. He navigated the treacherous social currents with a bored, effortless grace, his silent authority parting the crowds before him. He introduced her to no one, keeping her in their own private bubble amidst the chaos. It was in this glittering, dangerous environment that she finally understood the true scope of his power. It was not just about fear. It was about a level of influence so profound that it bent the world to his will without a single overt threat. Later, as they stood on a quiet balcony overlooking the illuminated sprawl of Central Park, the distant city lights like a carpet of fallen stars, the fragile peace was shattered. A man approached them, his smile thin and predatory. His name was Marco Valenti, a known rival of Angelo's, his eyes glittering with a cold, serpentine intelligence. He ignored Angelo completely, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "A new acquisition, Rinaldi?" Valenti purred, his voice dripping with insinuation. "You always did have an eye for fragile things. One must be so careful not to break them." The words were a direct and unambiguous threat, aimed not at Angelo but at her. In an instant the air turned to ice. Angelo did not raise his voice. He did not move a muscle. He simply turned his head slowly and fixed Valenti with a look of such pure, chilling lethality that Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat. The temperature on the balcony seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "She is with me," Angelo said, the three words spoken in a low, flat tone that carried more menace than any shout. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact, a line drawn in blood. Valenti's smirk faltered, a flicker of genuine fear appearing in his eyes before he masked it and retreated back into the party. The moment Valenti was gone, Angelo turned to her. The cold fury in his eyes was replaced by an intense, protective focus. He took a step closer, his large frame completely eclipsing her, shielding her from the prying eyes of the party inside. He raised a hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. "He will not touch you," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "No one will." The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of night air, and the terrifying, undeniable safety she felt in his presence. She stood there, trapped in the intensity of his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The danger was no longer an abstract concept. It was real. It had a name, and it had just looked her in the eye. But more powerful than the fear was the overwhelming sensation of his protection, a feeling so absolute it was suffocating. He had publicly declared her his, placing her under the umbrella of his violent world to shield her from its storms. In that moment, pressed close to the man who was both her savior and her captor, she realized there was no going back. She was no longer on the edge of his world. She was standing squarely in its dark, dangerous center. The ride down in the private elevator was a descent into a shared, suffocating silence. The memory of his hand on her cheek, the low-timbered promise of his protection, lingered on her skin like a brand. She could feel the coiled tension in him, a dangerous stillness that had replaced the bored indifference he wore at the gala. He stood beside her, not touching. Yet his presence was an overwhelming physical force, a shield and a cage all at once. The faint scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of leather and spice, was the only anchor in the dizzying fall from the glittering heights of the museum back to the city's concrete reality. She understood now that his world was not a place you could simply visit. Once you stepped inside, its shadows clung to you, becoming a part of your own. The parking garage was a stark, brutalist cathedral of concrete and shadow, the air cold and smelling of gasoline and damp stone. The opulent sounds of the gala were replaced by the lonely echo of their footsteps. He led her toward a black, unassuming sedan, his hand now resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of guidance that felt more like a claim. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things, with the threat Marco Valenti had so casually issued. Eleanor's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a primal instinct screaming that the danger had not passed. It had simply followed them down from the penthouse, waiting for them here in the echoing darkness, far from any sympathetic eyes. It happened with the swift, silent efficiency of a predator's strike. As Angelo reached for the car door, two figures detached themselves from the shadows behind a thick concrete pillar. A third emerged from the opposite direction, cutting off their escape. They were not common thugs. They moved with a disciplined, predatory grace that mirrored Angelo's own. There was no shouted demand, no posturing, only the glint of metal in the low light and the cold, professional certainty of their intent. Valenti had not wasted a moment. The public challenge required a public answer, and she was the message he intended to send. The world slowed to a crawl, each detail sharpening with terrifying clarity as the trap snapped shut around them. Angelo's reaction was instantaneous, a fluid explosion of motion so fast she almost missed it. He spun, shoving her behind him with a force that sent her stumbling back against the cold metal of the car. His body became a living shield, his broad shoulders eclipsing her entire view of the men. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl she had never heard before. It was the voice of the Dawn, the monster from the stories, stripped of all its sophisticated veneer. But in that moment, as she huddled behind him, a strange, defiant clarity cut through her fear. She was not just a victim. She was the reason this was happening. She was the fragile thing Valenti had threatened to break. From her vantage point behind him, she saw what he could not. The third man, flanking them, raising his weapon not at Angelo, but directly at her. Time fractured. In that single, horrifying second, her entire life of quiet compliance, of swallowing injustice and staying invisible, burned away. A sound tore from her throat, a raw, desperate cry. "Angelo! To your left!" Her voice, sharp with terror and adrenaline, echoed in the concrete tomb. It was an act of pure, unthinking transgression. She had broken her silence, abandoned her role as a protected piece on the board, and screamed his name into the heart of the violence. She had chosen a side, and in doing so had irrevocably entered his war. Her warning was all he needed. He moved with a brutal, devastating grace, a whirlwind of controlled violence. It was not a brawl, it was a disassembly, a sharp crack of bone, a muffled groan, the sickening thud of a body hitting the concrete floor. He was not just a man of power and influence. He was a weapon, honed by a lifetime of survival, in a world where mercy was a fatal flaw. He dispatched the first two men in a matter of seconds, his movements economical and final. But the third man, the one she had seen, was faster. He recovered from his surprise and fired. The gun shot, a deafening cannon blast in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash, a brief, violent star. Eleanor flinched, her eyes squeezed shut, but she felt no impact. When she opened them, she saw the impossible. Angelo stood between her and the gunman, his arm outstretched, the attacker now slumping to the ground. But something was wrong. A dark stain was spreading across the pristine white of his shirt, just below his shoulder. He had taken the bullet meant for her. He had moved into the path of the shot, a deliberate sacrificial act that shattered every illusion she had about him. He had not just shielded her. He had willingly taken the wound, breaking the first and most sacred rule of his world. Never expose yourself. Never bleed for anyone. The silence that descended was absolute, heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. The only sound was their ragged breathing, mingling in the cold air. He turned to her slowly, his face a mask of grim control, but his eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded fire. He ignored the wound, his gaze sweeping over her, a frantic, desperate search for any sign of injury. He took a staggering step toward her, his left hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone in a gesture of profound, aching relief. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice rough with pain and adrenaline, his only concern for her safety, even as blood seeped through his suit jacket. Her own hand came up, trembling not to push him away, but to touch the torn, blood-soaked fabric on his shoulder. Her fingers brushed against the wound, and she felt the warm, wet stickiness of his blood. The contact was electric, a current of shared pain and terrifying intimacy passing between them. In that single touch, the carefully constructed walls between their worlds crumbled to dust. She was no longer the innocent waitress, and he was no longer the untouchable Don. He was just a man, bleeding in a dark garage because he had chosen her over himself. The weight of his sacrifice settled in her soul, a debt that could never be repaid, a bond forged in blood and terror. He flinched slightly at her touch, his control finally fracturing. He closed his eyes for a brief second, his entire body shuddering with the impact of what he had done, of the line he had crossed. He had built an empire on a foundation of calculated distance and emotional invulnerability, and he had just demolished it with a single impulsive act of protection. He had shown her his weakness, his one and only vulnerability. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and in their dark depths she saw not a monster, but a man drowning in a past he could not escape, who had just found something he was terrified to lose. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening truth of their new reality. The world did not spin back into motion. Instead, a second car, as dark and silent as the first, materialized from the deeper shadows of the garage. Men in dark suits moved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, their faces impassive. They were not panicked. They were professionals managing a complication. One of them gently but firmly guided Eleanor away, his grip impersonal, while two others helped Angelo into the back of the waiting vehicle. Before the door closed, he looked at her one last time. His gaze was not one of affection or reassurance. It was a command, cold and absolute. Disappear. Be safe. Then he was gone. The squeal of tires echoing in the concrete tomb, leaving her alone with the ghosts of 3 fallen men and the deafening silence of his absence. She made it home in a daze, moving through the city like a sleepwalker. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet solitude, now felt like a cell. The silence was different now, heavy and accusatory, filled with the phantom echo of the gunshot. She stood in the center of the small room, his blood a dark, drying stain on the sleeve of her borrowed gown, and a faint smear on her trembling hand. She stared at it, mesmerized. It was a physical remnant of his sacrifice, a tangible piece of his world that had breached the walls of her own. Outside, the city glittered with an indifferent beauty, its millions of lives continuing, completely unaware that a universe had just been shattered and remade in a dark, concrete cavern beneath its feet. The days that followed were a lesson in negative space. The city's memory was ruthlessly short, and its newspapers were silent. There was no mention of a shootout, no report of injured men. The incident had been erased as if it had never happened, a testament to the terrifying scope of his power to control reality itself. The dark sedan that had been a silent sentinel on her street was gone. Mr. Dubois remained in his suburban exile. The world Angelo had altered for her remained altered, but the architect of those changes had vanished completely. The void he left was a cold, constant presence, a hollow ache in her chest that was far more painful than the fear she had felt when he was near. In a sterile, private room high above the city, Angelo Rinaldi recovered. The physical wound was a minor inconvenience, a familiar pain in a life defined by it. The true injury was deeper, a hemorrhage of the soul. He had broken his own cardinal rule. He had made it personal. By taking that bullet, he had painted a target not only on his own back, but on hers as well. He had shown his enemies his only weakness. The retaliation from Valenti's family would be swift and merciless, and the only way to protect her was to sever all ties, to push her so far out of his orbit that she would become a ghost again, invisible and therefore safe. The decision was a strategic necessity, and it felt like a self-inflicted wound. Terror, Eleanor discovered, had a half-life. It decayed, and in its place grew a strange and painful lucidity. The fog of her naivete had been burned away by the muzzle flash in the garage. She finally understood the true nature of the world he inhabited, a place where protection was paid for in blood, and loyalty was a blade. She replayed his actions not with the shock of a victim, but with the dawning comprehension of an equal. He had not saved her from his world. He had initiated her into its brutal logic. The quiet moral certainty that had once been her anchor was gone, replaced by the complex, agonizing understanding that a monster had shown her the most profound act of humanity she had ever witnessed. She could not return to the pinnacle. The thought of its hushed opulence, of serving men like the councilman, now felt like a grotesque parody. She quit without notice, leaving behind the last vestiges of her old life. The letter from the collection agency confirming her debt was settled, which she had once viewed with a mixture of relief and shame, now sat on her table like a verdict. It was not a gift. It was a shackle of gratitude, binding her to a man she could never see again. He had bought her freedom from one cage, only to lock her in another, one made of memory, obligation, and the constant, throbbing awareness of the violence he had absorbed on her behalf. Rain became her constant companion, washing the city in shades of gray. She would spend hours at her window, watching the drops trace erratic paths down the glass, blurring the skyline into an impressionistic watercolor of melancholy. The city was no longer a symbol of oppressive power, but a monument to their separation. He was out there, somewhere behind that veil of rain and light, breathing the same damp air, existing under the same bruised sky. The distance between her small Queens apartment and his Manhattan penthouse felt both impossibly vast and as thin as the pane of glass she pressed her forehead against, a fragile barrier between two separate lonely worlds. From his own window, a plate of glass that spanned an entire wall of his penthouse, Angelo watched the same storm. Luxury was the most exquisite form of isolation, and he had never felt it more acutely. He was surrounded by loyal soldiers, by the mechanisms of his empire. Yet he was utterly alone. His world was one of whispers, of strategy, of the constant threat of betrayal. He had brought her light into it for a brief, reckless moment, and its absence now made the shadows seem deeper, more absolute. He fought the instinct to send a car, to have her watched, to know she was safe. because he knew that his very attention was the greatest danger he could place upon her. One evening, when the silence in her apartment became too heavy to bear, she cleared the small table and pulled out one of her old architecture textbooks. She opened it to a chapter on cantilever bridges, structures that reached out over an empty space, held aloft by a delicate, powerful balance of tension and compression. She traced the clean, confident lines with her fingertip, but she was no longer escaping into a fantasy. It was a purposeful act, a decision. He had paid her debts and cleared her path. The only way to honor the terrible price of that freedom was to use it, to start building something new from the wreckage of the life she once knew. The weeks bled into a month, and the silence between them solidified into an unspoken covenant. It was a living thing, a testament to what had passed between them in the dark. She began taking night classes, her days filled with the clean, logical world of blueprints and stress formulas. He waged a quiet, brutal war against his rivals, consolidating his power and ensuring the threat to her was permanently neutralized. They moved on parallel tracks, forever altered by their collision, bound by a debt of blood and a shared moment of impossible grace. Their silence was not an ending, but a vow held across an impossible distance. 2 years passed, a length of time measured not in days but in the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life. Eleanor stood on a stage, bathed in the cool, artificial light of a press conference. Before her, on an easel, was the architectural model for a new community library, a structure of glass and reclaimed wood designed to bring light into a forgotten corner of the Bronx. Her design had won a prestigious city grant. She wore a simple, professional dress, her hands resting on the cool metal of the podium, her voice steady as she spoke of public spaces and the dignity of shared knowledge. The ghosts of the pinnacle, of borrowed gowns and the scent of blood, were a lifetime away. She had built a new world for herself, one of clean lines and solid foundations, a world where she was no longer invisible, but the creator. As the polite applause began, she scanned the faces in the crowd, journalists, city officials, proud members of the community. Her gaze drifted toward the back of the auditorium, near the shadowed archway of the main exit. It was there she felt it, a sudden, familiar weight in the air, a pull as undeniable as gravity. A man stood apart from the others, his form a dark silhouette against the bright light of the lobby. He was not applauding. He was simply watching her, his stillness a pocket of profound silence in the noisy room. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a heart-stopping moment the entire world narrowed to the vast, impossible distance between the stage and the shadows where he stood. It was not fear that seized her, but a deep, aching recognition that resonated in her very bones. He had not changed, yet he was entirely different. The years had etched deeper lines of command and solitude onto his face, the silver at his temples more pronounced. He wore the same dark, impeccable suit, the same armor of controlled power. But the cold, predatory stillness was gone from his eyes. In its place was something she had never seen before, a quiet, unguarded contemplation. He was not the Dawn assessing a new asset or the Protector shielding his vulnerability. He was just a man, bearing witness to the life she had built from the ashes of the one he had nearly destroyed. Then, as their eyes held across the chasm of their two worlds, he gave a single slow nod. It was a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken words. That single nod was a confession, an absolution, and a release. It was an acknowledgment of her strength, a final settling of all accounts. It said, "You owe me nothing. You never did." It was his redemption, found not in changing who he was, but in the profound, selfless act of letting her become who she was meant to be, far from the poison of his world. A single, silent tear traced a path down Eleanor's cheek, not of sorrow, but of a peace so absolute it felt like a homecoming. She had spent 2 years running from his memory, only to find in this final, silent encounter that he had been the one setting her free all along. He had honored his sacrifice by ensuring she would never have to pay for it. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent farewell that spanned an eternity, then turned and melted back into the flow of the city, becoming just another shadow in a world of them. He was gone. The applause faded back into her awareness. The lights felt warm on her skin again. The weight in the air had lifted, leaving not an emptiness but a quiet, foundational strength in its place. The bond forged in a dark garage was not broken. It had been transformed. It was no longer a chain of debt and fear, but an invisible, unbreakable thread of shared humanity, a secret she would carry, not as a burden, but as a quiet testament to the man who had bled for her so she could learn to fly. Some debts are not meant to be repaid, only honored by the lives we choose to build in their wake. Her life, from this day forward, would be that honor. If this story of sacrifice and silent redemption touched your heart, let it echo by liking and sharing it with someone who understands the power of a single, meaningful choice. Tell us in the comments what you believe true redemption looks like, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove that even in the darkest corners of the human soul, a flicker of profound light can change everything.